"Don't drink that," she said quietly, but the words landed like a crack through glass, sharp enough to slice through the music, the laughter, the low hum of $1 million room, and for a split second no one moved, not the man holding the crystal glass, not the guests gathered beneath the warm glow of imported chandeliers, not even the servers gliding silently across polished marble floors, because a maid wasn't supposed to interrupt. Wasn't supposed to speak, and definitely wasn't supposed to speak in fluent Italian. Richard Halston's hand hovered inches from his lips, the deep red wine catching the light as it trembled slightly, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned his head, his expression shifting from mild irritation to something colder, sharper, as his eyes found her, standing near the edge of the room in a simple black uniform. Tray balanced steadily in her hands as if nothing about this moment was unusual, as if she hadn't just frozen an entire room filled with executives, investors, and people who measured their worth in digits and influence. A faint chuckle broke somewhere behind him, low and dismissive, followed by a whisper. "Did the maid just speak?" And then another voice, amused. "In Italian?" But Ava Brooks didn't react, didn't shrink under the weight of a dozen curious, skeptical, or outright mocking stares. She simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, her eyes not on the crowd, not on the power surrounding her, but locked on the glass in Richard's hand, as if that single object mattered more than everything else in the room. Richard let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth tightening. "You're interrupting my event," he said, his voice controlled, practiced, the kind of tone that had closed deals and ended conversations, but beneath it was something else now, something uncertain, because the way she had spoken, the precision of it, the calm certainty, it didn't match the role she was supposed to play. Ava took one step forward, just one, the soft sole of her shoe barely making a sound against the marble, and repeated the warning, slower this time, clearer, each word deliberate, unmistakable. "Non bevi è pericoloso." And this time the room didn't laugh, this time the silence deepened, stretched, turned heavy, because across the room, a man in a tailored gray suit stiffened, his glass lowering slightly as his face lost color, his eyes flicking between Ava and Richard, calculating, recognizing something the others didn't yet understand. The music, once smooth and ambient, now felt distant, like it belonged to another space entirely, and the clink of ice in a nearby glass sounded too loud, too sharp, as if the room itself was beginning to listen. Richard's grip tightened around the stem of his glass, his confidence pressing back against the doubt trying to surface. "You think you know something I don't?" he asked, quieter now, more dangerous. But Ava didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, in that small pocket of silence, something shifted, something invisible but undeniable, because she wasn't guessing, she wasn't reacting, she was certain, and certainty didn't belong to someone in her position. Her fingers adjusted slightly on the tray, steady, controlled, and when she finally spoke again, her voice dropped just enough to pull the room closer without raising it at all. "Sir, please," and, for the first time since the interruption, there was something else in her tone, not fear, not hesitation, but urgency, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard, the kind that made people listen even when they didn't want to, and somewhere behind Richard, the man in the gray suit took a slow step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly did she say?" As every eye in the room shifted, not to the millionaire, not to the spectacle, but to the maid who refused to step back. The man in the gray suit did not wait for permission, he stepped closer into the circle of light, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble as his eyes fixed on Ava with a kind of urgency that did not belong in a room built on control. "She said it is dangerous," he murmured, his accent unmistakable now, the smooth cadence of someone who had grown up with the language. "Not just unpleasant, dangerous." And the words settled into the air like weight, shifting the balance of the room in a way no one could ignore. Richard's jaw tightened, his posture still rigid but no longer effortless, his confidence now forced, held together by habit rather than certainty. "Dangerous how?" he asked. But the question was no longer directed at Ava alone, it was directed at the room, at the possibility that something had slipped past his carefully managed world. Ava did not rush to answer, and that pause again, that deliberate control, made the silence stretch tighter, sharper, as if every second without explanation pulled the tension further. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in focus, as though organizing something precise in her mind, then looked back up at the glass still trembling slightly in Richard's hand. "That bottle should not be here," she said, her voice even, measured, each word placed with care. "It does not belong to the shipment listed in the inventory." And now there were more reactions, subtle but undeniable, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged, a flicker of unease crossing faces that had moments ago been relaxed and entertained. Somewhere near the bar, a server hesitated, her hand hovering over a tray of identical glasses, unsure whether to move or remain still, while the soft music continued to play, now completely out of place, like a soundtrack that had missed its cue. Richard's eyes narrowed, his attention sharpening, not on Ava as a maid, but on Ava as a problem he could not immediately solve. "You are telling me you know my inventory?" he said, and there was a trace of disbelief there, but also something else, something closer to caution, because the certainty in her voice did not match ignorance. Ava inhaled slowly, the faint scent of polished wood and aged wine filling the air, grounding her, steadying her, and when she spoke again, there was no hesitation. "I helped unload the delivery this afternoon," she said, and for the first time, a few guests blinked in surprise, because that detail did not fit the image they had assigned to her. "There were 12 bottles of that label," she continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward the table where the wine had been displayed earlier. "All accounted for, all sealed with the same marking." And now her gaze returned to the glass in Richard's hand. "That one is different." The words landed softly, but the implication hit harder than anything loud could have, and the man in the gray suit exhaled under his breath, a quiet, uneasy sound. "Different how?" he asked, leaning in just slightly, as if proximity might clarify what logic had not yet caught up with. Ava's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, not out of fear, but out of control, holding herself steady as the weight of every eye in the room pressed in, and then she said it, calm, precise, undeniable. "The seal was replaced." And this time, no one laughed, no one whispered, because now the room was no longer watching a maid step out of line, it was watching a possibility unfold, one that did not care about status or titles, one that could not be dismissed with a smile or a command. And Richard slowly lowered the glass, not because he had been convinced, not yet, but because for the first time that evening, doubt had entered the room and refused to leave. The word replaced did not echo loudly, but it spread, quiet and invasive, threading through the room like a draft no one could see but everyone could feel, and for a moment no one spoke because no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what it implied. Richard's fingers loosened slightly around the glass, not enough to drop it, but enough to betray that something had shifted, his eyes moving from Ava to the bottle on the table across the room. Then back again, recalculating, measuring, as if trying to decide whether this was absurd or something far worse. "That is a serious claim," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, and the authority in it felt different, less performative, more cautious, while the man in the gray suit stepped closer still, his attention fixed on the glass with a focus that bordered on unease. "May I?" he asked, gesturing slightly, and Richard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before extending the glass toward him. A small movement, but one that did not go unnoticed. The room watched as the man took it carefully, holding it up to the light, turning it just enough for the chandelier above to catch the surface. And there it was, subtle, almost invisible, but once seen, impossible to ignore, a faint irregularity along the rim where the seal would have been broken and reapplied, a detail too small for most. But not for someone who knew what to look for. A quiet murmur rippled through the guests, no longer dismissive, now edged with something sharper, curiosity mixed with discomfort, as the illusion of control began to fracture. Ava did not move, her posture unchanged, but inside, her awareness sharpened, every sound clearer, the soft clink of glass against glass at the bar, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the measured rhythm of her own breathing, steady and deliberate, because she knew this moment was no longer about being heard, it was about what came next. Richard watched the man's expression closely, reading the shift as it happened, The tightening around the eyes, the slight pause before he spoke, and when the words came, they were careful. Controlled, but no less significant. She is. Correct, he said, not loudly, but with enough clarity to cut through the room, and this time the silence that followed was heavier, grounded, real. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to Ava, but it was not the same look as before, not irritation, not dismissal, but something unsettled, as if he was seeing her for the first time without the filter of expectation. Explain, he said, and it was not a command now, it was a request disguised as one, because the certainty he had relied on all evening was no longer enough. Ava stepped forward another inch, just enough to close the distance without overstepping, her voice calm, steady, anchored in something deeper than the room. The marking on the original seal is embossed, not printed, she said, her eyes briefly flicking to the bottle across the room. It catches light differently, you can see it if you look at an angle. And the man in the gray suit adjusted the glass again, tilting it slightly, and there it was again, the difference, subtle but undeniable, confirmation layered over observation. A guest near the table took an involuntary step back, as if distance alone could create safety, while another quietly set their own glass down without being told. Richard's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition, because this was no longer speculation, this was fact, and facts did not bend to status. He glanced toward the bottle display. Then back at Ava, his voice quieter now, almost measured. How did you notice something like that? And the question lingered, not just in the air, but in the shift of every gaze in the room, because now they were no longer looking at a maid who spoke out of turn. They were looking at someone who had seen what they had all missed. The question did not come with anger, but it carried weight. The kind that pressed quietly against the room, waiting for an answer that could either settle everything or unravel it further, and Ava felt every eye settle on her again, heavier now, no longer dismissive but searching, measuring, trying to understand how someone in her position had seen what none of them had. She did not rush, did not fill the silence too quickly, because timing mattered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, grounded. Because I was not just carrying the boxes, she said, and a faint shift moved through the crowd, subtle but real, as assumptions began to loosen their grip. Richard's gaze narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. Then what were you doing? He asked, and the question was different now, stripped of ego, shaped by something closer to need. Ava adjusted her grip on the tray, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged. I was checking them, she replied, and a few brows lifted, confusion flickering across faces that had never considered that possibility. Every label, every seal, every crate, she continued, her words precise, deliberate. Because mistakes happen when people assume no one is paying attention. And the statement hung in the air longer than expected, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. The man in the gray suit glanced toward the bottle display again, his expression tightening as if replaying the earlier moment in his mind, connecting pieces that had not seemed important before. Somewhere near the back, a guest quietly stepped away from the table, placing their untouched glass down with careful precision, as if even proximity now felt uncertain. Richard shifted his stance slightly, the movement small but noticeable, the ease he had carried earlier now replaced with something more controlled, more deliberate. You are telling me you inspected a private delivery without being asked? He said, and there was no accusation in it, only a need to understand the boundaries she had crossed. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady. I noticed one crate was not logged correctly, she said. The count was off by one, and the seal on that crate did not match the rest. And now the room leaned in, not physically, but in attention, as if every word she spoke pulled them deeper into something they could not yet see clearly. So I checked it, she added. Simple, direct, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss. The man in the gray suit let out a slow breath, his voice quieter now. And you recognized the language? He said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Ava gave a slight nod. It was not just the language, she replied. It was the phrasing. And that word landed differently, sharper, more specific, as if it carried meaning beyond translation. Richard's eyes flickered, something shifting again behind them. What phrasing? He asked, and this time the room felt smaller, tighter, as if everything depended on what came next. Ava's gaze dropped for just a moment, not in uncertainty, but in memory, as though she was reaching for something precise, something that mattered beyond this room, beyond this night. And when she looked back up, there was something deeper in her expression, something personal. The way it was said, she answered quietly. It was not a casual warning. She paused, just long enough for the silence to settle. It was specific. And the word hung there, deliberate, unmistakable, as the weight of it began to take shape, not just as a detail, but as a signal that this moment was no longer about a mistake, it was about intent. The word specific did not fade, it settled, heavy and deliberate, and the room seemed to tighten around it, as if everyone present understood, at least in part, that this was no longer about a simple irregularity. And for the first time that evening, no one reached for their glass, no one laughed, no one tried to smooth the moment away. Richard's gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with a growing awareness that something far more controlled had been placed in his hands just minutes ago. Specific to what? He asked quietly, and the question did not carry authority anymore, it carried weight, the kind that demanded truth. Ava inhaled slowly, her shoulders still, her posture unchanged, but inside, something steadied further, because this was the moment where silence would no longer protect anyone. Specific to dosage, she said, and the word landed with a different kind of force, precise, clinical, unmistakable, and across the room, the man in the gray suit closed his eyes. Briefly, as if confirming what he already feared. That phrasing, he murmured under his breath. It is not casual, it is measured. And the implication spread quickly, quietly, like a ripple no one could stop. A guest near the bar shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the exits as if distance might offer clarity, while another leaned closer to their companion, whispering something that never fully formed into sound. Richard's hand, now empty, hovered briefly at his side before lowering completely, his control no longer effortless but intentional. Deliberate. You are suggesting this was prepared, he said, and even though his voice remained steady, there was a fracture beneath it, something that had not been there before. Ava did not nod immediately, she did not rush to confirm, because the weight of that statement did not need reinforcement, it already existed in the space between them, but when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm certainty. Yes, sir, she said. Prepared and calculated. And this time the silence that followed was not just heavy, it was final, because now there was no room left for dismissal. The man in the gray suit set the glass down carefully on the nearest table, as if even touching it longer than necessary felt wrong, his movements controlled, precise, mirroring the tone Ava had carried from the beginning. This is not something one guesses, he said, his eyes moving between Ava and Richard. This is something one recognizes. And the distinction mattered because it separated instinct from knowledge, coincidence from experience. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the bottle display once more. But this time he did not look at it as a host admiring presentation, he looked at it as a variable he no longer understood. And you recognized it, he said, turning back to Ava, and now the question was no longer whether she had overstepped, it was how far her understanding went. Ava's fingers tightened slightly against the tray, not from fear, but from the memory rising beneath the surface, controlled, contained, but present. Yes, she said, quietly, and for a brief moment, her voice carried something deeper than before, something personal, something that did not belong to this room but had followed her into it. Because I have heard it before. And the words did not need explanation to change the atmosphere. Because now the room was no longer just witnessing a discovery, it was standing at the edge of a story none of them had expected, one that connected knowledge to experience, and experience to something far more difficult to ignore. The room did not move, it breathed, slow and shallow, as if even the air understood that something irreversible had just surfaced, and Ava's words lingered in that silence, not loud, not dramatic, but anchored in something far heavier than speculation. Richard did not speak immediately, his gaze fixed on her, searching, not for weakness, but for inconsistency. For anything that might allow him to dismiss what he had just heard, but there was none, only that same steady presence that had not wavered since the moment she spoke, and it unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. Somewhere behind him, a glass was gently set down against the table, the soft contact sounding louder than it should have, drawing attention to the fact that others were beginning to follow the same instinct, creating distance, quiet, cautious distance. The man in the gray suit shifted his weight slightly, his hands now clasped loosely in front of him. His posture no longer that of a guest, but of someone observing something critical. "Where did you hear it?" he asked, his tone careful, not intrusive, but precise, because the answer mattered, not just for the moment, but for everything it suggested. Ava's eyes did not move from Richard at first, but there was a subtle change, a depth that had not been there before, as if the question had opened something she had kept controlled until now, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but it carried something quieter beneath it. Something grounded in memory. "In a hospital," she said, and the words shifted the room again, not dramatically, but enough to pull attention inward, away from the spectacle and into something more personal, more real. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in concentration. "You worked in one?" he asked, and Ava gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I studied there," she replied, and that word, studied, landed differently. It did not fit the uniform she wore. It did not align with the role everyone had assigned her, and the room felt that contradiction instantly. The man in the gray suit's eyes sharpened, recognition flickering briefly. "Pharmacology?" he asked, and Ava met his gaze for the first time since he had spoken. "Yes," she answered simply, and that single word shifted everything, because now the knowledge was no longer abstract, it had a foundation, a discipline, a reason. A quiet ripple moved through the guests, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, as assumptions gave way to something else, something closer to respect, or at least uncertainty. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just enough to reveal the weight he was now carrying. "And this phrasing," he said, his voice quieter than before. "It is used how?" And the question no longer challenged her, it relied on her. Ava glanced briefly toward the glass resting untouched on the table, the deep red surface now still, reflecting the chandelier above like a calm surface hiding something beneath, and when she spoke again, her tone was steady, precise. "It is used when the amount matters more than the substance," she said. "When the goal is not immediate, but controlled." And the words settled heavily, not because they were dramatic, but because they were exact, and exactness left little room for denial. The man in the gray suit drew in a slow breath, his gaze shifting toward the bottle display, then back again. "Then this was meant for someone specific," he said, and this time it was not a question, it was a conclusion, and as the weight of that realization settled into the room, Richard's eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, from the glass, to Ava, and then to the guests surrounding him, as if for the first time, he was no longer certain who, in this room, he could trust. The realization did not explode, it settled, slow and heavy, like dust after something unseen had already shifted, and Richard felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle change in the room, the way conversations had stopped completely, the way people now stood just a little farther apart, their eyes sharper, more guarded, as if every familiar face had become a question instead of an answer. He turned slightly. Not abruptly, but enough to take in the room from a different angle, no longer as a host surrounded by guests, but as a man standing in the center of something he no longer controlled, and for the first time that evening, the polished space around him felt less like a stage and more like a calculation he had not solved. The man in the gray suit remained still, his gaze scanning the room with quiet precision, not accusing, not reacting, but observing, and that calm focus made the tension sharper, because it suggested that this moment was no longer emotional, it was analytical. Ava did not move from her place, her posture unchanged, but her awareness widened, every shift, every glance, every breath in the room registering without effort, because this was no longer about proving anything, it was about what came next. Richard's voice, when it came, was lower, steadier, but stripped of the earlier certainty. "If this was intended," he said slowly. "Then it was intended for someone here." And no one interrupted him, no one tried to deflect, because the truth of that statement had already taken hold. A woman near the far end of the room adjusted her clutch slightly, her movements controlled but too deliberate, while a man beside her avoided eye contact altogether, focusing instead on the reflection of the chandelier in the floor, as if that could anchor him somewhere safer. The music continued faintly, but it no longer belonged. It had become background to something far more present, something far more real. The man in the gray suit stepped forward just enough to align himself beside Richard, not above, not below, but level, his voice calm, measured. "Then the question is not what was done," he said, "but who knew it would reach him." And that distinction landed with precision, because it narrowed the possibilities, reduced the unknown to something smaller, more focused, more dangerous. Richard's gaze shifted again, slower this time, moving across the faces around him, not as a host recognizing guests, but as a man searching for intention, for calculation, for anything that did not belong, and the room responded in kind, subtle shifts, held breaths, eyes that looked away just a fraction too quickly. Ava watched him, not with judgment, not with fear, but with clarity, because she had seen this shift before. The moment when certainty gives way to awareness, and awareness changes everything. Richard finally turned back to her, his expression no longer guarded by status, no longer shielded by expectation. "You said it was controlled," he said, and now his voice carried something different, not authority, not doubt, but trust forming in real time. "Then it was meant to be unnoticed." And Ava gave a slight nod, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Yes," she said. "Meant to blend in, to wait, to act, without drawing attention." And the words settled into the space between them, completing the pattern that had been forming since the moment she spoke. The man in the gray suit exhaled slowly, his gaze narrowing as he looked toward the table where the bottles were arranged, then back at the guests. "Then whoever did this," he said softly, "is still here." And this time the silence that followed was not just heavy, it was absolute, because now every person in the room understood that the danger had not passed, it had only just been revealed. No one moved, not because they were told to stay, but because something in the room had shifted beyond instruction, beyond control, and Richard could feel it pressing in from every direction, the weight of eyes, of silence, of a truth that had turned his carefully constructed world into something uncertain. He straightened slowly, not to reclaim authority, but to steady himself within it. His voice when it came was calm, deliberate. "No one leaves," he said, and the words did not echo loudly, but they carried, firm enough to settle into the edges of the room, not as a command of power, but as a boundary drawn out of necessity. A few guests exchanged quick glances, subtle, restrained, but the movement was there, a flicker of discomfort now fully visible, because what had begun as an elegant evening had transformed into something else entirely, something none of them had agreed to be part of. The man in the gray suit nodded once, not approving, not questioning, simply acknowledging the direction the moment had taken, his attention already shifting toward the table where the bottles remained untouched. "We should isolate the source," he said quietly, stepping toward it with measured precision, his movements careful, intentional, as if every inch of distance mattered. Ava remained where she stood, her tray still balanced in her hands, but her focus no longer on the glass or the bottle, her awareness now tracking the room itself, the subtle patterns, the way people held themselves when they believed they were not being watched, because this part, this silent unraveling, it was not unfamiliar to her. Richard's gaze followed the man briefly, then returned to the guests, slower now, more deliberate, as if each face held a possibility he could not yet define. "This did not happen by accident," he said. Not loudly, but clearly enough that it reached every corner. "Which means someone here knew exactly what they were doing." And the statement settled differently than before, because now it was no longer abstract, it was personal. Near the far end of the room, a man adjusted his cufflinks with unnecessary precision, his movements controlled but slightly delayed, as if his focus had shifted inward, while a woman beside him kept her posture perfectly still, her expression neutral, too neutral, the kind that avoided attention rather than met it. The man in the gray suit reached the table and paused, examining the arrangement without touching anything, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the spacing, the alignment, the details others would overlook. "The placement is intentional," he said after a moment, his voice low but clear. "The altered bottle was positioned within reach, not displayed prominently, but not hidden either." And that observation added another layer, another dimension, turning randomness into design. Richard felt the weight of that, the precision of it, and for the first time, there was no room left for doubt, only questions, and he turned again, this time not scanning, but searching. "Who had access to the deliveries?" he asked, and the question did not target Ava, it moved beyond her, into the structure of the evening itself, into the invisible systems that had allowed this moment to exist. Ava stepped forward slightly, just enough to be heard. Without interrupting, her voice steady. "Anyone overseeing the setup," she said. "Anyone who knew the schedule, the timing, the layout." And as she spoke, the room shifted again, because now the circle was narrowing, not outward, but inward, toward those who understood more than they should have. Richard's eyes moved once more across the room, but this time they did not stop at faces, they lingered on details, on patterns, on presence, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his gaze paused. Not because something was obvious, but because something was not quite right, and in that small hesitation, in that quiet recognition, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what he would see next. Richard did not speak right away, and that silence, longer than any before it, became the loudest moment of the night, because everyone felt it, the shift from uncertainty to recognition, the moment when something invisible finally takes shape, and his eyes remained fixed in that same direction, not moving, not blinking, as if the answer had already formed and he was deciding what to do with it. The room followed his gaze slowly, almost unwillingly, until attention settled on a single point, subtle, quiet, but now impossible to ignore. A man standing near the edge of the gathering, positioned just far enough from the center to avoid notice, yet close enough to observe everything. His posture composed, his expression neutral, but not naturally so. It was practiced, controlled, the kind of stillness that comes from effort, not ease. Ava saw it the same moment Richard did, not because it was obvious, but because it was different, the absence of reaction where reaction should have been, the lack of curiosity in a room full of it, and her grip on the tray tightened slightly, not from fear, but from certainty. The man in the gray suit followed their line of sight, his eyes narrowing just enough to confirm what had already begun to take form, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, but unmistakably clear. "You have not moved once," he said, and the statement was not loud, but it carried across the silence with precision. The man turned then, slowly, not startled, not defensive, just deliberate, as if he had expected this moment to arrive eventually, and for a brief second, the room held its breath again, waiting for denial, for explanation, for anything that might return the evening to something familiar, but none came. Richard stepped forward, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with purpose, each step controlled, each movement intentional, and when he stopped a few feet away, his voice was calm, but stripped of all pretense. "You oversaw the deliveries," he said, not as a question, but as a fact aligning itself in real time, and the man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker, brief but enough. Ava watched closely, her voice entering the silence one last time. Steady, grounded. "He was near the crates longer than anyone else," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what she had observed, and that clarity removed any space left for coincidence. The man in the gray suit exhaled slowly, his posture firm now, no longer observing, but confirming. "And he knew the timing," he added, completing the pattern that had been forming piece by piece. For a moment, nothing happened, no raised voices, no sudden movements, just the weight of truth settling into place, undeniable and complete, and Richard's gaze did not waver, because now he understood, not just what had been done, but how close it had come, how easily it could have gone unnoticed, how dependent the entire outcome had been on a single voice that no one had expected to hear. He turned slightly then, just enough to look back at Ava, and in that glance something Unspoken passed between them, not gratitude expressed, not apology spoken, but recognition, real and unfiltered. And then he looked forward again, his voice steady, final. "This evening is over," he said, and no one questioned it, no one resisted, because the meaning was clear, not as an ending, but as a boundary, a line drawn between what had been and what had almost happened. Ava stepped back quietly, her role returning to silence. But not the same silence as before, not invisibility, not dismissal, but something different, something earned. And as the room slowly began to shift, to breathe again, to move with cautious awareness, she turned toward the service hallway, her footsteps soft against the marble, the sound barely noticeable beneath the quiet hum returning to the space, and behind her, the world of polished glass and controlled voices continued without her. But something had changed within it, something that would not be undone. Because in a room built on power, it had not been authority that altered the outcome, it had been clarity, spoken at the exact moment it was needed. And as Ava disappeared into the quieter light beyond the doorway, the last thing that remained in the room was not fear, not tension, but the undeniable presence of truth that had chosen to be seen.